Chapter 26. The bottom of the gorge was leaping up at me, and I sat with my head between my knees until my stomach stopped heaving. Moonboy was sitting beside Grief of Dawn with her limp hand held in his. Master Li turned from the gorge, shaking his head in disgust, but not at the prince. "When somebody performs my autopsy, he'll open the skull and pull out a turnip that's been masquerading as a brain," he said sourly. "I still can't begin to come to grips with this weird case." I stared at him. Even Moonboy raised his eyes from Grief of Dawn. Master Li shrugged. "We'd have to be mindless as millipedes not to guess that the human involvement has been almost incidental. What matters is a stone." He began pacing back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped and glared up at heaven. "How the hell do you expect idiotic humans beings to understand?" he shouted impiously, and then he resumed pacing. "The ancients gave up trying to understand," Master Li muttered. "After a couple of 1,000 years of watching fire transform solid pieces of wood into insubstantial heat and light, they produced the first law of Taoist science. There is no such thing as a solid object. 5 centuries later, they produced the second law. All matter consists of bundles of pure energy called qi, the life force, and shi, the motion force. Another 5 centuries passed, and with the third law, they threw up their hands and quit." He stopped pacing and grinned at us. "Believe it or not, there's a point to this," he said. "Ox and our late friend gave a marvelous demonstration of the first and second laws by adjusting their qi and shi to that of seemingly empty air and taking a walk. An ox's dream about an orange-colored piece of clay unconsciously echoed the third law. All energy is controlled by adherence to classical patterns." Master Li resumed pacing. "Ox dreamed that the clay had a pulse that followed an unusual pattern. The third law states that the humblest piece of clay must adjust its qi and shi to that of the perfect piece of clay, and the energy of stars must follow the patterns of the perfect star. Every plant, animal, insect, drop of water, mote of dust, everything in the universe has a classical model to guide it, and those perfect patterns are the building blocks in the barrier against anarchy, called the Wall of Heaven. That's when the ancients said to hell with it, and stopped. You see, the next step required understanding the nature of universal energy as a whole, and such a thing is completely past the capabilities of the human mind." Master Li stopped and shook a finger at us for emphasis. "This can be said. Nothing in all existence is more important than maintaining the wall of heaven. Nothing. The forces are so awesome that should the barrier fail and energy run amok, the universe itself wouldn't last a second. The task of maintaining the wall is that of the goddess Nu Kwa, and what the goddess wants, the goddess gets. For unfathomable reasons, she wanted a stone that had a flaw in it, and then when she couldn't repair the flaw, she dropped it in our laps." Master Li sat down between Moonboy and me and took Moonboy's pieces of the stone. He carefully fit them together with the piece from the prince and held the stone up to the light. "There's the flaw, see? A tiny vein of gold ran through it. Gold is pretty stuff, but terrible for a stone, particularly when you're building a wall." I hadn't noticed it when the pieces were apart, but now I saw the faint yellow lines at the edges of the cracks. "According to one of the annals of heaven and earth, assuming it existed, the goddess finally had to reject the stone, but not until contact with her hand had given it a soul," Master Li muttered. "2 great philosophers later used it for an inkstone, and the touch of heaven produced divine calligraphy. Prince Liu Pao used it to steal from the gods in order to paint pretty pictures. And I wonder—" He let the sentence die a natural death while he swiftly bound the stone together with the cord he had cut from the prince's neck. He opened his wine flask and dipped the stone inside. After a minute he lifted the stone back out and removed the cord and placed the stone upon the grass. He lifted the flask to his lips, and I saw a slow, sensual shudder spread throughout his body. and when he raised his head, his eyes were shining with reverence. "Jade Emperor, if this is what you serve in heaven, preserve me long enough to become a saint," he whispered. Moonboy and I took small sips. I have no words for it. The raw alcohol of Haining Mountain Dew had become the nectar of the gods, and to describe it I'd have to steal from mystical accounts of divine revelations. "Talk about temptation," Master Li exclaimed. "I could start making this stuff by the lakeful and be deified on the spot." The taste had the greatest effect upon Moonboy, who turned pale as death and began rocking back and forth with powerful emotion. I thought he was going to weep until I realized he never did. Moonboy did not cry, not even when Grief of Dawn lay dead. Master Li was looking speculatively at him. "You know, it's quite possible that I'm making the same mistake twice," he said thoughtfully. "I didn't see the obvious about the prince because it was too simple, and now I may be straining to understand something that doesn't require understanding. Perhaps all we need to know is that the goddess Nukwa is blowing on the dice for one last desperate roll, and all we can do is pray they come up with a pair of blind queens. After all, we must assume that the stone is one of the most important objects in the universe. Why else would she go to the trouble of Moonboy?" Moonboy stared at him. So did I. And the old man threw his head back and laughed until tears flowed. "What a creation is Moonboy," he chortled. "My lad, on the one hand, you're the apotheosis of beauty, irresponsibility, and unbridled sexuality on a rampage. And on the other hand, there isn't an evil, unkind, or even unpleasant bone in your body." Master Li shook his head wonderingly. "We may be sure that art is involved, for such a combination of excess and innocence is not to be found in nature. He said, "You couldn't possibly have perfected guiltless sin without experimenting with the common garden variety. And when Ox and I watched you stand before the mirror of past existences, our subconscious minds played a duet. Buddha, what a series of incarnations! From baseness to depravity to malignancy to monstrosity, culminating in an incarnation as the most dissolute and irresistible slut ever to shake her rear end across the pages of history." Master Li wiped his eyes and winked at me. "Come, Ox, surely you recognized her. I thought every boy in China had memorized the more indelicate passages of her biography." I remembered having seen Moonboy dressed as a girl, and then I realized he had been a girl, and then I turned bright red. Suddenly his incredible beauty made sense, and I recognized the lady in the mirror all right. "Golden Lotus," Master Li said happily. "Moonboy once walked the earth as a man-eating seductress, so spectacularly immoral that she was elevated to heaven to become the greatest patron of prostitutes in history. And I suspect that the goddess Nukwa began to think deep thoughts about peculiar combinations of Qi and Shi the moment Golden Lotus began jiggling down the pearly paths, causing havoc among the young gods. Golden Lotus was removed from her post and given a new form. Remember it?" I remembered Moonboy in the mirror, changing and yet not changing, still beautiful, but blending with bright colors, lifting his face and arms toward the sun almost like a flower, Master Li said softly. "A beautiful, flawed flower named Purple Pearl, who was placed in the path of a flawed stone. And the stone brought dew and raindrops to wash the evil from the flower, and the flower fell in love and vowed to repay its debt by shedding every tear in its body. It might take centuries, or even millennia, for the time to be right, for a flower to be reborn. But the greatest virtue of stone is patience." Moonboy's eyes were wide and wondering. Master Li picked up the stone, pieces still pressed together, and placed it in Moonboy's hands. Then he took his wine flask and stood up. "This will seem very silly, but who cares?" he said. "Clasp the stone tightly, Moonboy. Close your eyes. Try to imagine a place without water near the river of spirits, and dryness and wilting. And then a faithful stone flying up with the morning dew of heaven. Moonboy closed his eyes and clasped the stone. Master Li waited, and then he tilted the flask and sprinkled drops of heavenly nectar over Moonboy's head. The effect wasn't silly at all. Moonboy trembled all over and squeezed the stone against his heart, and from his lips came an indescribably beautiful singing sound that gradually resolved itself into words. Love, love, but I have no tears. Not even as a child could I cry. How can I cry for a stone? Love, 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 but I cannot cry. Master Li motioned for me to follow him. We will leave you for a while, he said quietly. A flower that vows to shed tears is making a very serious commitment, and neither gods nor men have the right to influence the decision. He walked away. We went around the peak to the far side of Dragon's Left Horn, and Master Li sat down on a flat rock and gazed out at the valley. Peasants were scurrying around fearfully, but so far as I could see, the damage from the earthquake was limited to fallen thatched roofs and a few collapsed barns. Soft blankets of shadows were sliding over the fields, and the birds were singing their last songs. Master Li tilted the flask and reverently rolled the liquid around his mouth before swallowing. "Ox, I think Prince Liu Pao should be a hero," he said thoughtfully. "It's better that way, even though it may cause long-term problems for his heirs. We'll tell the abbot that the prince fell in the final triumphant battle against the forces of evil, and never again will his abominable ancestor threaten the Valley of Sorrows." "Yes, sir," I said. "The peasants will want a temple for him, but a shrine should do." Oh, Master Li was beginning to warm to the subject. "Make that 2 shrines," he said enthusiastically. "We'll say he wished to be cleft in half, from top to bottom, and each half buried in one of the destroyed areas of Prince's Path to fertilize new plants." "Yes, sir," I said. "He'll be the holy half-princes of the Valley of Sorrows, each half turning the seeing side to the peasants' good deeds and the blind side to their bad. And the legend of what will happen when danger threatens and the 2 halves are reunited should be very interesting. I hope the Cave of Wolves survived, because the boys should get to work on it at once." "Yes, sir," I said. "His last words were that he longed to lie in his graves and listen to the innocent laughter of children and the blissful bleating of little lambs and No, sir," I said. "I suppose you're right," Master Li admitted. "Peasants will go only so far. You'd better handle that part of it." "Yes, sir," I said. His last words were instructions to his heirs to repair the damage from the earthquake and give the monastery a new roof. "Good boy," Master Li said. "And fix the dike at the intersection of paths between the monastery, village, and estate. One torrential rain and the melons will wind up in Suchow. Anything else?" No, sir," I said. "Anything else, and the peasants will expect the prince's heirs to repair their sandals and empty the chamber pots." We sat in silence. Master Li's wrinkles seemed to be older than the seams and cracks in the hills across from us, and his mood was turning melancholy. "You know, the prince was right," he said. "I'm almost the last advocate of the old way of doing things. Perhaps it's just as well. If one leaves out the Neo-Confucians, there's much to be said for the modern style. Still, I hope you keep filling your notebooks as a record of an archaic approach to problems. There's a good deal of fun to be found in the old way, and a good deal of beauty, and the practitioners seldom expired from ennui. "Yes, sir," I said. He looked at me gravely, and then he nodded. We got up and started back. I tried to prepare for it, but still it was like a blow to the pit of my stomach, and tears blurred my eyes. "Oh, Moonboy," I sniffled. He always did things neatly. Master Li's knife had been carefully cleaned, and he had built a small dam of earth so the blood from his slit wrist would build up around and over the stone, without staining the grass unnecessarily. Moonboy had placed Grief of Dawn's hand over his, with the stone beneath them, and Master Li walked up and gently lifted the hands, and picked up the stone. He washed it in the wine it had produced, and dried it on his tunic, and held it up to the light. "Oh, ox, what a beautiful piece of work," he whispered. A stone had once washed evil from a flower. Now the flower had shed the tears it had saved up to wash the flaw from the stone, and there wasn't a trace of a crack or a sign of soft gold. The 3 pieces were one, and it was as solid as a stone can be. Master Li turned and raised his head toward heaven, and drew in great lungfuls of air. I covered my ears, but still the high, harsh eagle screams that burst from the old man's throat hurt my eardrums. The screams lifted one after another, shooting to the crimson clouds, and the echoes bounced back and forth between the peaks. He dropped to his knees. I followed his example. "It is Li Kao," he said simply. "I pray to be allowed to address the goddess Nu Kwa." We knelt there in silence while clouds began to cover the sky. I suppose it was my imagination, but I began to sense something else that stretched from horizon to horizon. A vast maternal presence. "Goddess," Master Li said politely, "forgive me for beginning with a minor matter, but I have sworn a vow. The current patron of prostitutes is an incompetent disgrace, and the whores of China wish her to be replaced. Since the Great Golden Lotus is scarcely available, they have nominated Empress Wu." The air was growing sulphurous. Thunder rumbled. "Well, perhaps it might not be a good idea to let a woman like that run around loose," Master Li hastily conceded. "I have been authorized to select a substitute, and I humbly nominate Tao Wan, wife of the late Laughing Prince. It is true that she attempted to murder her maid, but I have yet to meet a lady of quality who has not had the same urge now and then. So far as I know, she took no part in her husband's massacres and tortures, and as for her qualifications, she was immoral, lecherous, seductive, avaricious, blessed with a heart of the purest granite, and as tough as a person can get, without infringing upon the supernatural. She was intelligent and brooked no nonsense, and would surely be a first-class manager. I cannot imagine a better representative of prostitutes, and should she cause trouble, it would only be necessary to send her a cool drink, with lots and lots of ice in it. May I be so bold as to hope that a formal petition would receive favorable omens?" The smell of sulphur faded away, and the thunder died down. Master Li bowed again. "Goddess, the world of men is a world of incomprehension," he said softly. "Our senses are woefully limited. Our brains are but tiny candles flickering in an infinity of darkness. Our only wisdom is to admit that we cannot understand. And since we cannot understand, we must do the best we can with faith, which is our only talent. The greatest act of faith we are capable of is that of loving another more than we love ourselves. And occasionally we can be quite good at it." He reached out and placed the stone upon the grass. "We thank you for hoping that one tiny talent of man might achieve what other forces could not," he said. "We thank you for sending us a flawed stone that would call across the centuries to a flawed flower. We thank you for sending us the flower that would answer the call and come with the greatest gift love is capable of. We thank you for bringing the pieces together, and we pray that a stone and a flower will finally be granted the acceptance of heaven." He bowed flat to the ground. So did I, but I peeked, and Master Li did too. A slanting sunbeam slid through the clouds and glided across the grass to the stone. I had the feeling that it was probing and testing as it moved over the surface. Then everything stood still. The birds stopped singing, and the insects stopped buzzing, and the animals stopped rustling. Even the breeze stopped blowing, while the stone slowly lifted from the grass and came to a halt about 4 feet up in the air. I heard a humming sound. A light was glowing inside the stone, and a vibration made my head spin. The inner light began to pulse faster and faster, and the stone began to shake. The hum was now a muted roar of incredible power, and a halo of light began to spin around the stone. Another halo crossed it, and another, and another. The stone was glowing with blinding light, and the halos formed a dizzying pattern of interlocking rings. And I knew with absolute certainty that the full chi and shi of a simple stone was powerful enough to reduce the valley of sorrow to a tiny pile of ashes. The vibration still accompanied the roar, and the stone still shook. The roar increased, and the stone threatened to shake itself to pieces. Moonboy was turning transparent, shimmering and melting and fading into nothingness, and something was appearing upon the shuddering surface of the stone. Colors deepened, buds lifted and opened, and we gazed at a lovely flower. The roar of power stopped vibrating, and the stone stopped shaking. But then the power level lifted again. Unbelievable force! And the shaking and vibrating reappeared. Now Grief of Dawn turned transparent. Her body melted like mist, and only the bent grass testified to the fact that it had lain there. And something else appeared upon the stone. A slim, graceful, green creeper moved around the circumference, wrapping a stone and a flower in an eternal embrace. And the roar stopped vibrating, and the stone stopped shaking. Again the roar of awesome power grew stronger and stronger. The spinning halos were now seamless, and nothing could withstand the force as the energy level approached the infinite. Nothing. Yet the stone remained absolutely steady and resolute, and I lost my fear that it would burst. Then the blinding light faded, and the roar faded, and the halo spun slower, and the stone began climbing to the clouds, picking up speed, streaking like a tiny comet toward the great river of stars, and the goddess Nuqua, and the wall of heaven. The distant twinkle of light faded away, and was gone. Master Li stood up and stretched. "How would I know?" he said, answering the expression on my face. "I'm no more capable of understanding the universe than the ancients were, and I applaud their good sense in leaving heavenly matters to the gods. All I know is that certain things seem to work, and certain things don't." He turned and gazed across the gorge. "Well, Prince, fraud may rule the world, but classicism still packs a wallop when one removes the neo from it," he said to the embers of the studio. "Classical truths still apply, and classical values still define the limits, and classical standards still hold the universe together." He turned to me. "Come on, Ox. Let's find a place where they still know how to get classically drunk." "Yes, sir," I said. I bent over, and he hopped nimbly up on my back. I turned and began loping down the path toward the monastery, and then on to Peking, and Heaven's Bridge, and the Alley of Flies, and the wine shop of One-Eyed Wong. The end of the story of the stone.